So we're here to talk about gerunds and gerundives this time, and we'll not really get into passive periphrastic that much, which is the most frequent use for gerundives, but we will look at it very briefly and perhaps in a whole separate video. So first off, gerunds and gerundives. They are not exactly the same thing, but they're very similar, and they're both recognized the exact same way. A gerund is a verbal noun, so that means you take a verb, but you're going to use it as you would a noun. So, Cloelia got across the Tiber by swimming, not by boat, not by bridge. Those are both nouns, but by swimming. It is a verbal noun. Whereas gerundives, we don't really have in English unless you want to use a specific vulgar word, but we quite often, again, use an ing, and it's used as a verbal adjective. In English, we just use a normal participle that covers that purpose. For the Romans, they have a whole separate system, which is their gerundive. It specifically is the future passive participle. So instead of the you are, we're going to end up having a different form. They look very similar. There are fewer gerund sort of forms than gerundive forms, but they're going to look alike. So let's start with what they look like. If you start with a verb, let's start with our amo, amare. To make the gerund, you are going to get rid of your RE, so you've got that same stem we always have, AMA, and to that, you're going to add the letters ND. And then after that, for a gerund, we're just going to look at gerund right now, you can add an I ending, you can add the dative O ending, you can add the accusative UM ending, or the ablative O ending. There's no nominative sort of form, but we do have the genitive, dative, accusative, and ablative singular forms. So your present stem, the letters ND, and then these four possible endings. So let's try this with a different verb. If we had a second conjugation verb, like video, videre. We know a second conjugation because it's got that long ERE, which actually my macron's not quite over my E there. We're going to form our gerund the exact same way. We drop the RE. That gives us that we day stem. To that, we're going to add the letters ND. And then to that, we can add a genitive singular ending, a dative singular ending, an accusative singular ending, or an ablative singular ending. All right, let's try this though with a third conjugation verb. I'm going to use my beloved mito, mitere. We know it's third because it has that ERE, but no macron on the ERE. So we end up with that stem. This one we're just going to drop the RE this time. Mite. Exact same thing as the last time. Add our ND to show that it's a gerund, and then any sort of those endings. The genitive I ending, the dative O ending, the accusative UM ending, or the ablative O ending. The same thing's going to end up happening when we go to third IOs. So let's use everyone's favorite facio. This is where we get a little tricky with our stem because we need to keep the I, but we're also going to have the E. So it's more like we're combining them and getting ourselves facie. And to that, we're going to add our ND. And to that, we add the same genitive sort of ending, dative ending, accusative ending, or ablative ending. So facie ND. For third IOs, please remember that the I needs to be there in almost every single form. There are very, very rare exceptions where the I is missing. So you need to make sure that you're always remembering if there's an I in the first principal part, there's going to be an I in almost every other single form. And let's then close with a nice fourth. Let's use our aldio, aldire. All right, we get our stem again by dropping our RE. That gives us aldi. We can't go straight into the ND. That would be, the I is too weak of a vowel. We see this over and over again. So we're going to put an E, and then we're going to add our ND. And to that, we're going to add our and then we put our nd. And then again, genitive ending, dative ending, accusative, or ablative ending. We've seen this before. This should not be that weird. And as you're reading Latin as opposed to composing Latin, it won't be that odd to recognize seeing that E before the ND. In fact, the ND is what should be standing out to you, not any other part of this word. So that is how you form a gerund. Pretty straightforward, very, very simple. The issue is, when would you ever use a gerund? And so let's make sure we label this. Our gerund, again, that's the noun form of it. So as I like to joke, verbs and nouns go to a party and have a little too much Bacchus juice, and gerunds are their little love child there. If you want to say, Kikero, my beloved there, put a little heart next to him. Kikero is skilled, not skilling, but skilled in speaking. In English, that speaking looks no different than any other sort of like participle for us, but it's being used as a noun, not as an adjective. So we're not saying the speaking man was going on and on and on and on and on, boring his audience. We're saying that this is a noun, something in which he is skilled. So you could have your normal sentence. Kikero est. We want a word for skilled, so let's go with peritus. Agree in number, case, and gender, even though they don't look alike, because est always has balanced equation there. And now we need to say skilled in speaking. Well, peritos, as the AP saw in their last, one of the recent vocab lists, and you help them with that, is a word that takes the genitive. And so we need to have a genitive of speaking. So that's, let's use a deponent one, that would be so fantastic. So we have our loquendi. And that's why we have that genitive sort of ending, so that we can use it with nouns, adjectives, and verbs. Well, not really nouns, but verbs and adjectives that take a genitive. Very seldom when you see it outside of that sort of context in the genitive. So that's a genitive use of it. Let's look at a dative. There's one that the textbook Wheelock's loves to use, like, he gave himself to studying Latin. Trying to fix the glare there. He gave himself to studying. And actually, we're just going to leave it as studying. There should be a Y. That's a Y. Pretend. So we have our he. We need it. Gave, did it. Himself. This is that wonderful reflexive pronoun we've been seeing over and over again. Say. To studying. So we need a dative form of our gerund of the verb studio, to study. So since it's studio, we want to make sure we keep that I in it, because if it has an I in its first principal part, it's going to have an I in all of its other forms there. Studi in do. All right. You will not see dative all that frequently, to be perfectly honest. Ones that you're going to see more frequently are your accusatives and your ablatives. So if we're going to look for an accusative one, we'll often see that with an ad. So I'm looking at one for what we've had with Caesar lines already. So ad, so, and Parati sunt is a variation on one of the lines that AP had in book 1. When the Helvetians are looking at leaving, they were prepared to endure, to undergo. That does not sound very much like a gerund for us. We think like it should have an ing, but really it's they were prepared to undergoing, it's like to deal with the things that they were going to endure. And let's look at one ablative. So let's go back to my beloved Kikero. Kikero won by speaking. So that same speaking that we had before, but this time instead of saying he's skilled in this or skilled of this, as Latin would say, we're using a different preposition by, which demands an adjective. So an adjective of means. We have our beloved Cicero. He won, so I'm going to use supero, superare, by speaking. We don't have to put a preposition in here. Like with so many of our ablatives, we really just need the form, and in English we have to supply the preposition. For a Roman, they would have understood the context for it. So let's use that same loquendo. Again, not really Latin syntax, but we see our subject verb and then our gerund for ablative of means. We cannot have any other forms of the gerund. We do not use the nominative form. We don't sure as heck don't have a vocative form for it, and there are no plural forms because why? It doesn't change anything if we say by speakings as opposed to by speaking. So this is one of the times that Latin reduces its forms down to just the ones it needs. Gerundives, however, can exist in all sorts of forms. Now, whereas our gerund was a verbal noun, gerundive is an adjective. Adjective, I can spell this. All right, so most folks will just remember that because, in fact, they both have that IVE ending to them. And most folks will, and you'll hear me anytime we hear this, emphasize the ND. You form it the exact same way we form a gerund. So if we have that man from loving there, you can have Amanda, and you can go ahead and have your long A, all the way down to the plural sort of forms. You can have Amandus, and have your second declension sort of masculine endings. And you can also have mendum, neuter sort of endings. And again, second declension, neuter sort of endings. On down. And the idea, since it's an adjective, it's going to have to agree in number, case, and gender with any word it's describing, so it needs to have all of the possibilities. Gerund didn't need all those possibilities. It actually only has one purpose, and it doesn't sound any different if it's singular or plural, masculine or feminine. By the way, we consider gerunds neuter, just like we consider infinitives neuter, which again is why I always put your fourth principal part as a UM, so that we know all verbs are neuter. But we have the gerundive needs to agree in every possible way, so we have to have all the possible forms. So amanda, amandai, amandai, amandam, amanda, and then we can have amandai, amandarum, amandis, amandas, amandis. And then same thing for the second declension sort of endings with this. Again, we see the ND, and this is the thing that stands out for students most of the time. So most students don't have a problem recognizing that a word is a gerundive or a gerund if it's all by itself. The problem becomes how exactly to translate it. So looking at this, since this is a future passive participle, really, since that's what's really going on here, it needs something to convey the future. So since in our participles we abandon the word will and we go to about to, since it's passive, we need the verb be and then verbed. So the thing about to be verbed is one way that you can translate it if it's in isolation. So there is a phrase that's coming up in the lines that the AP students are reading right now in book 5, where we have unum, and it's understood like leonum, and it has a few prepositional phrases, and it has ducendam. And so what we're saying here is one about to be led into a certain region. That's what the prepositional phrases tell us. So you can go hyperliteral like that, but most folks end up making this a little more idiomatic. So one of the constructions in which we're going to see this is with a causa. This is another Caesar line where we have causa inferendibelli. So causa means for the sake of, for the cause of, really, if that that makes it stand out more for you, but we most of the time translate for the sake of, and then we've got the gerundive inferendi, and we've got its object belly, for the sake of bringing in war. So that doesn't have the to be, or sorry, it doesn't have the about to be verbed aspect, but this is the way this idiom comes through. Now, some students will be like, well, why is this a gerundive as opposed to a gerund? And that's an excellent question, and the answer is because there's another word with it. Because it's not just for the sake of bringing in, which in that case it would be a gerund, but because we have something else with it, it's technically describing the belly. So really, for the sake of war about to be brought in. So that sounds really, really awkward in English, so we don't translate it that way. You can do that with calcia, you can also do that with gratia. So we'll see those constructions every so often. And then another one that shows cause that uses this is add. And so we have, let's see, raise, conflict, and das. That one came up a lot in Caesar Book 1. You know, they were doing this for the sake of, which is what we're doing with the add, fixing the things. We'll just go with fixing for that. Really, for the thing about to be fixed is what's going on. But again, that sounds awkward in English. Unless you want to go there, you can. That's hyperliteral, and literal is always right. It's just not pretty, and it makes you start doubting what you're doing. So let's look at a few famous ones of this. The gerundive most famously is used in construction called the passive periphrastic. You'll never need to know how to say that or spell that in your life. It doesn't come up that frequently in your day-to-day conversation. This literally means a roundabout way of saying something in the passive. And so this is how we get that must idea. And the most famous one of these is Carthago. Let's see, a little delenda est. Carthago delenda est. This is the famous line of Cato the Elder saying this repeatedly over and over again. He gives a great speech about why they should go to war with Carthage, and he closes it with Carthago delenda est. And he's giving a speech about why taxes need to go up, and he says, reminds the Romans, Carthago delenda est. And he's given an invitation to dinner at his house, next week, and he says, Carthago delenda est. Every single time he said it on everything. Romans got tired of it. But what we have is a feminine singular noun, Carthago, the city. Delenda, which means about to be destroyed, and it's feminine to agree. And so we know that this is a gerundive and not a gerund. It's feminine to agree with Carthago est. Now that sounds really very weak. If we're like, oh, Carthage is Carthage is about to be destroyed. That sounds more like a future sort of thing to us. But Latin, once you put these two words together, it becomes must. Carthage must be destroyed. No way around it. We need to tear it apart brick by brick, burn it to the ground, and sow the earth with salt so that nothing will ever grow there again. So that's a famous passive periphrastic, and we'll look at some constructions with this in a separate video, since Caesar's used this a few times, and we're going to see it a lot in Virgil, and we want to make sure that you're comfortable with that one. But gerunds and gerundives can also exist on their own. There is actually, there are a few gerunds and gerundives that we use as everyday sort of words. You saw Amanda. Amanda actually means the girl who must be loved, or about to be loved. The same is true when you see agenda. It's got that ND in it. This is a gerundive, and it really means things about to be done. You can have a criminal's MO, which is their modus operandi. I think that's spelled correctly, but I'm not entirely sure. Their modus, their method of operating. It's being used as a gerund there. And then you can have, this is a fun one the Romans had, the rex bibindi. Sometimes also called the magister bibindi, or sometimes the arbiter bibindi, which means the king of drinking, or the teacher of drinking, or the decider of drinking. And this is not actually something very weird. It's just when you have a conversatio, a dinner party where folks are going to be drinking, you throw the dice and you decide who gets to be the guy in charge of how much water goes into the wine. When it's the arbiter of avidity, I like to think about it as someone who's like cutting you off at some point. Be like, nope, you've had too much. You don't get any more. They get to decide that. So we see this form every so often in phrases and words that we use outside of Latin, but we're going to see it quite frequently in Latin. And so I've got some sentences for you to do, old NLE style. So look through those, use this to watch again if you need to. And thank you for watching about gerunds and gerundives.